New York Governor Kathy Hochul has proposed a new plan to combat domestic terrorism following the Buffalo grocery store shooting, which she said is white supremacy in this nation at its worst. The new plan would strengthen state gun laws and investigate social media platforms promoting violent extremism.
The announcement from yesterday includes an executive order requiring the state police in New York to seize weapons under the state's red flag law from people determined to be a threat to themselves or others. So I was reading, I think, in a New York Times story recently that, this law is in effect, but despite some red flags emerging about the perpetrator, he wasn't barred from purchasing, his parents purchased him the gun, right? And there was no oversight that would have prevented him from having access to this, even though he had been pulled aside at school because he had made some threats there. He was definitely under the eye of the system. He had been noticed as a potential threat. People said he's the kind of person who would do this. So what do you guys make of this?
So really, it's really, really difficult, I think, to go and try to figure out how to stop this sort of crime from happening, and how do they prevent people like this person who is clearly deranged and crazy, how do they prevent them from getting their hands on weapons? I find it really interesting, though, that it seems that what we're used to, which is always whenever these events happen, there's always this kind of robust debate about gun laws and restrictions and how we can prevent people from getting access to guns. But in this particular instance, it seems that almost people have given up on that debate a bit, and they've moved on now to attacking the free speech, right? So they're saying, well, now we've got to go after social media platforms. So we can't actually get any meaningful gun legislation passed to keep people safe. And so instead, we're going to move towards how do we prevent these people from even expressing their ideas? But if they can't express their ideas on social media, do you think that's actually going to prevent the crime from happening?
No, it's such deflection. I've complained about this in my radar from earlier this week, but she's trying to blame the platforms. She's trying to blame speech for law enforcement failures. For other failures. We played that video. It was yesterday, right? The video of the audio of the interview with the person who said when she dialed 911, she's in the grocery store, the 911 operator hung up on her. Why don't you investigate that? That's a state resource. Yeah. Investigate the people who actually work for the government, whose jobs are to keep us safe, who screwed up. What did they do wrong? Maybe they did nothing wrong, but that's where we look for weaknesses in the system to deflect this blame. Oh, it's Twitch's fault. Oh, it's Discord's fault for allowing speech.
So the problem here is, to your point, Robby, there are laws in effect. They're not being enforced. It is also true that there are, warning signs that exist in the communications people have on these websites that are also not being picked up. So there's two issues here. There's you can shut down the speech, or you can, when the speech is there and maybe should be brought to the attention of law enforcement, acted upon, and these red flag laws would come into effect. And there's this third question that I think is interesting and potentially not what the governor is talking about, but the fact that so much active recruiting from white supremacist groups happens through it's not like video games is making people violent, but it's that so many of these games have these chat functions now. There are active recruitment efforts that happen through these avenues. And when you read the manifesto, you see that he was at home because of COVID and was radicalized. He was kind of generally disaffected and became increasingly radicalized by communications that were coming through these outlets. And so what to do about that? And then what to do about the fact that a lot of these websites do have a algorithmic push toward more incendiary comment? Is there a responsibility from an outlet to be, instead of promoting cat videos, well, maybe not cat videos, since this guy apparently also tortured a cat or something,
I saw PETA's statement. They were very upset about it.
But, towards something more pleasant and less socially maladaptive, and instead pushing a lot of folks. I see it happening to myself. The algorithm will push you toward the kind of incendiary, socially maladaptive content. Should they be responsible for doing that?
But it's just, and that could be bad on its own. But I don't know that them doing that makes people, because the numbers of people who are going to go out and shoot a bunch of people in an insane, orgy of violence like this guy. Like, it's so rare. It is rare. It doesn't happen a lot. It seems like it happens a lot because we pay a lot of attention to it. There's a lot of violence in this country, but it's not. Actually, mass shootings constitute a very, very low percentage of all the violence.
That's true, but it's still so much more than it ever happens in any other country where you don't have, like we have, more guns than human beings, gun laws that people largely agree with. This isn't a bipartisan divide on common sense gun reform. It's just that the laws are not enforced, and then some laws are not even implemented because there is so much lobbying from the NRA and those kinds of organizations.
I don't think the guns are out there. We can't wave a magic wand and make them all disappear. We can't even make a significant chunk of them disappear. And I am not really persuaded that significant new restrictions on buying guns or possessing guns would substantially reduce crime, given that most of the violent crime is guns out in the community, just one-off shootings, not this kinds of mass episodes of violence. There are also a lot of people don't know, a lot of death by firearm is suicide. There's probably a better argument to be made that gun restrictions would reduce that, but I at the end of ideologically, I'm not super inclined to limit people's rights because other people will misuse.
Well, what about, but here's the thing, there's positive freedoms and there's negative freedoms, right? So what is the right as an American citizen to walk around, to be in your church, to go to the grocery store, to be in your synagogue, and not fear that a gunman is going to come in who has been radicalized, perhaps purposefully because the algorithm pushed you in a certain kind of way, perhaps because he just lives in an environment where he feels like he doesn't have a lot of opportunities and his precarity and social economic factors have weighed in on him, perhaps because he was radicalized by someone in his real life, whatever the reason. Great replacement theory is something that he's seeing on a lot of these right-wing websites, whatever the reason. What is your freedom as an American to be free from thinking that you're going to be gunned down in those kinds of situations?
If we disarm that person, we also, because we have to be consistent, we disarm people who live in unsafe communities that are not being protected by the police
We're not talking about disarming, though. We're talking about what policy interventions, even putting gun regulations aside. Because as I said before, this is an issue where we have regulations in place that aren't being enforced. So assuming that Kathy's right, that we just need to enforce things, what to do from a policy perspective, because that's how we open this, right? What is the policy intervention that can help people not be radicalized in these ways? Or are we saying, well, it's not my church, it's not my grocery store, I'm not the one getting gunned down, so I'm kind of comfortable with the status quo? Because that's, I think, what a lot of people who are the victims of these crimes are feeling like right now, as the targeted nature of these is kind of pushed under the rug for a conversation about either gun reform or mental illness, which I also am not entirely clear was the case here. When I read his manifesto, it was a very cogent, very racist, very anti-Semitic, but very cogent explanation of why he thinks Black people are inferior, Jewish people are inferior, a little bit like a small short paragraph on Asians and Arabs, but that, there's a white genocide that he perceives to be in place because of replacement theory, and that he needs to go and even the playing field by killing Black people. Like, how do you prevent that kind of radicalization from happening? I'd love to hear that kind of a conversation.
A lot of times I think crazy people don't seem crazy. So I think it's easy to kind of look at things like this and then to say, well, this guy didn't sound crazy, even though I think a lot of that document was copy and paste. I don't think a lot of it actually came from him. But crazy people are oftentimes able to come across as not crazy. The issue was that when you actually look at all of his ideas, a lot of them contradicted one another. Like when he was saying what his political ideology was, he was claiming that he was, had spent many, many years as a communist and then moved a bit more to the right from communism and has moved into eco-fascist nationalism, socialism.
Not inconsistent. A lot of people's ideology shift. We're going through a great shift as a whole nation right now, as so many people feel abandoned by both parties, and people are all over the map and changing. Elon Musk just said that he's shifting from voting Democratic historically to voting Republican. I don't think that's a sign of someone being deranged.
Well, except this person says in the same one document says, leftism leads to degenerate society, and conservatism is like synonymous with corporatism, and
he's calling out establishment politics. He's taking a line that a lot of conservative populists are taking, which is a dissatisfaction with both corporate parties, and saying, Republican conservatism is a problem and leftism is a problem. I'm charting my own path. I mean, I frankly think that's really in line with, frankly, what a lot of Americans are feeling right now, which is what is so troubling to me about reading the document.
Yeah. When I did reporting on sort of the alt-right a few years ago, I went to some of the rallies they had in D.C. to speak to what brings you to this kind of ideology, this event. It seemed like it was a 33%, 33%, 33% breakdown, basically, between people who were, so the first category is people who were almost racist from birth, like they had parents or grandparents who would have been in the KKK, like white racism was sort of baked into their family experience. And then there was another group of people who were sort of, this guy is kind of straddling the latter two categories, people who were radicalized online, but it was like irony first. It was trolling the libs kind of thing, and then it's like they're pretending I don't really think this. I'm just trying to trigger you. But if you do that for long enough, then eventually you do. It's not ironic anymore. You just do have those ideas. And then there's a third group that is just looking for the most extreme thing to try to wring some meaning out of a really miserable antisocial existence. A person who could have done Occupy Wall Street, and then, they're not radical enough. Eco-terrorism. They're not radical enough. What is the alt-right's ideas? Like, they could have joined ISIS. They're just looking for some crazy thing to shake up, because their lives are miserable and they're unhappy and they're mentally ill in some way, or they're mentally inadequate in some way.
Yeah, and if people are having those options, they're going to get put into one of those slots. I want to figure out how to get people to go do an Occupy Wall Street, or at least knitting, and not buying a gun and murdering 10 people in a grocery store out of racial hatred.
Right.
I think we just have to, really reform how our country is running, and it's not about taking guns away or changing how people access social media, but instead it's about lifting people up into a better economic situation. That is what we know, that crime is connected to economic problems. So I mean, if people are not feeling like they have opportunity, we see this all around the world. It's not just here in the United States. In certain parts of the world where there are groups like ISIS, we see people that when they don't feel like they have opportunity, they do become extremely radical, well beyond any sort of radicalization we see here in this country. So people can be radicalized very easily if they have nothing else to latch onto, like what Robby is mentioning. And that, I think that is really what we need is more of a discussion of how do we rebuild the middle class? How do we get the American people feeling like there's a future to actually get excited about? That's what we need.
And how do we restore social ties, many of which were eroded for other reasons, but also because of the pandemic, because of the need, or if you think it was a need, to socially distance and to lock down a lot of community ties, neighborly kind of behavior and community events and services fraying or going away, and which puts this, again, it's a small subset of people who are inclined toward antisocial behavior or to violence, who need to be, captured by those resources, those community support, family support, other institutions, so that they don't, fall on the other side of the line and start doing bad things. And that's unfortunately that we let a lot of that lapse, and I think it's part of the problem.
And to your point about antisocial behavior, Kim, another correlation, I saw, Crystal Ball talking about this, and I talked about it a little bit on my podcast today with a guest where we unpacked some of the issues that are raised by the manifesto, is that there is this correlation between rising crime rates and military interventionism. Our own country fighting, there's a correlation with people coming home from wars and not being able to distinguish what it meant to say that person is the enemy, go and shoot them, that's how you resolve conflict, and what people feel at home. And I do think that there is a certain modeling of conflict resolution that's going on where people really, when you read the manifesto, he feels like he is at war. He feels like there's a national, a global war against the white race, and he's being replaced, and the answer for him is not to figure out how to encourage white people to have more babies if that's your bag. It means literally exterminating other people, doing a genocide against other people because he feels like a genocide is being done against him. And I think that we have to reckon with the particular, noxious nature of that kind of ideology.
Well, tomorrow on Rising, Ryan Grimm and Emily Jashinsky will have a great show for you all, so stay tuned for that.
And we will be back with you next week.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. For those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. All right, guys, we're out of here. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.